Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining the first session of the IOP's Governance Lab. So this is a running series of conversations we're hosting for our newly introduced program, the Governance Lab, which will be helping students that are interested in Venture Meets Mission programming in the fall semester as an incubator for 5 to 10 Harvard startups focused in the civic tech and govtech space. But to kick us off, I'm so excited to introduce Sachin Subramanian, the CEO of Sweetspot, which is in the Y Combinator cohort of summer 2023. They're building an AI platform for government contracting, helping people from up and down the government space on finding their first government client. Sachin previously worked at Coinbase and graduated from UT Austin in 2022, and today is an amazing CEO who helps run Sweetspot. I'm going to pass it to you for some initial thoughts. Yeah.
Yep, really appreciate you putting this together, Prat. Hi everyone, my name's Sachin, CEO here at Sweetspot. We went through the latest YC batch and we've been focusing on building out our AI for government contracting solution. Super excited to talk a little bit more about it today and the rest of my journey as a startup founder.
Okay, awesome. So Sachin, could you tell us a little bit about your background, talk us through the Y Combinator process, things like the application. I know the application closes in a month or something like that. And tell us a little bit about Sweetspot, the company, and what it's doing today.
Yeah, for sure. So my background is traditionally like being a software engineer. My role has definitely shifted throughout the process of like beginning a startup. Originally, our idea was completely different. Our very first idea was text to order. A lot of this was implemented at food trucks where you would go to a food truck, scan a QR code, and like text what you wanted to eat. That was back when it was just myself and one of my co-founders, Philip. But things quickly changed. We got into the YC batch after submitting our application almost kind of like on a whim, and that was what we got accepted into. And then we quickly realized that we wanted to pivot to something else due to some advice from our group partners, and also after realizing that the distribution for working at food trucks and restaurants in general is just super tough. There's a myriad of different point of sale systems like Toast, Square, Aloha, etc. And then we pivoted into GovTech because we actually had a mutual friend whose job was to essentially like submit bids on government contracts all day. And we realized that there was a lot of potential in this space too, because there were a ton of VC dollars going to defense tech startups. And while a lot of these founders are great at building things, procurement is still kind of like a huge thorn for most people. So our initial goal was to build our startup, sell into some of these startups, and I think YC's really helped with that.
Awesome. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and like what got you to the YC process and navigate us through that?
Yeah. So essentially what got us into the YC process was more so de-risking what we were doing. Myself and my other co-founder definitely we left our jobs before then. I was quite frankly laid off, and I kind of had to convince my co-founder to also leave his job, but he eventually did on his own accord too. And we realized that things were going great with our old startup, but since it was so hard to actually go through the process of earning capital from it as first-time founders, we figured that joining an accelerator kind of like YC would add a lot of value. And as you know, since we were working kind of at a young age, straight out of college, recruitment is always a little hard when you don't have the resources to pay people. We're kind of big on not having unpaid interns, and also myself and my co-founder couldn't just do everything. And that's really where we realized that we could provide value, and YC could provide us value.
That's awesome. Yeah. For the actual application itself,
Yep.
Do you have any advice for the room on how to navigate that? We have a couple people doing the early interview round, which is February 21st. Some people who are thinking about doing the regular decision as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I would say some great advice for YC apps is to be very candid and blunt. This is especially important because they read through tens of thousands of these applications, and the more fluff you put, especially since a lot of people are using generative AI to come up with these answers now, it's super easy for certain phrases and certain answers to kind of get molded into one another. So definitely candidness is key. Another thing too is if you end up getting through, it's only a 10-minute interview, and that quite frankly it seems like a very short amount of time to make an investment decision, which is also why being very succinct, knowing your business in and out, knowing your numbers, and also trying not to pitch, but answer these questions comes off as better. Because at the end of the day, YC likes to invest in founders. The ideas often change throughout the course of the batch. So you also do need to have like a reasonable enough intuition, and also don't be overly like defensive ego-wise, because you are going to get corrected if like your idea isn't the greatest sometimes, right? So definitely show that you're coachable, willing to like change if you need to, and never have too much regard for your own work.
That's awesome. So could you tell us a little bit about Sweetspot, the kind of mission that you guys are doing, the progress y'all have made, and what you guys are looking forward to in the future?
Yeah, so Sweetspot's an AI platform for government contracting. We realized that this is such a huge need because the government processes have more or less been the status quo for the past like 30, 40 years when it comes to procurement. Our first initial wedge into the market was to build an AI-powered search engine. And the reason why we felt that this was the important part to get an initial wedge is the discoverability of some of these contracts, right? The number one thing SAM.gov and many of these other sites previously fed BizOps was that they relied on keyword search. So put yourself into the shoes that you're like a landscaper, right? You go on these sites and you look up lawn care. You'll find that the contracts only have the words like lawn or care in it in the search results. You don't really get matched to like landscaping, hedge trimming, like pesticide application, or anything in between. So that was our first idea, like, hey, let's get all this data, wrangle it, have a great search algorithm, and connect people to some of these opportunities. And now we realize that there's a lot of alpha in producing like the tedious aspects of it. And a lot of these are like managements of the task, the proposal writing aspect of it, and hopefully in the future, business intelligence as well.
Yeah, awesome. So what have y'all done successfully? What does the progress of Sweetspot look like from an idea that you did with your roommate, with your friends from college, to what it looks like now?
Yeah, for sure. So after we went through YC, we did raise our seed round. We'll be announcing that in a few weeks, but that did happen. Since then, we kept it pretty much like a lean team. It's still just the co-founders and Prat, who's like working for us right now as an intern. Additionally, I think one of the cool aspects on what we're doing so far is we've actually been able to see our technology help our customers. We've taken people who have never found government contracts in their life and helped them find some of these contracts, right? And the next step that we're trying to do is not just help them find it, but manage the entire like response application of it too. Ideally, like I can see us sitting as some sort of like TurboTax-like layer to government contracting, where it's kind of like a system that interfaces with the government, but still a private sector facing technology that just accelerates how people do some of these tasks.
Awesome. So in this entire room, you have many people who are interested in the space of government, the space of CS and technology, and bridging that gap. Do you have any advice for some of the emerging founders in this room for how to build in GovTech and thinking about early stage ventures in this space?
Yeah, so I would say like one like big piece of advice of building in GovTech is to try to network as much as you can with like your local government leaders. Attending like, orgs is a great way to do this, especially like alumni networks and such. Another thing is also be very aware of the security that you need to do. If you're building GovTech, you'll realize that there's a lot of compliance items you need to like check off, and this is particularly important if you're looking to build a product that sells either directly to the Department of Defense or you're selling a product to someone who's selling to the DoD. You need to get things like certain compliance checks in order, like either being hosted on AWS GovCloud, or I don't know, even like GCC high compliance if you're a Microsoft facing team. There's just a bunch of technical jargon over there, and you're gonna have to do like quite a bit of reading to understand it. And I think a unique insight I have into this too is like, I don't come from like a GovTech background, right? The way I learned about this space was through like hundreds of different like market research calls, talking to some of our customers, seeing the problems they had, and hearing their side of the story. Because while we don't interface with the government directly, we interface with customers who interface with the government directly. So we've been like aggregating a lot of their insights and using it to kind of form our own conviction at first, and moving forward we're actually looking to work potentially with the government themselves, and that'll require like its own fair share of like lobbying efforts and stuff, potentially applying to grants, but yeah, that's it.
And what unique opportunities does the government offer startups and people looking to work with the government that traditional market opportunities don't?
Yeah, so SBIRs and these grants are great. And they offer it to startups particularly because the number one case why a lot of startups don't even go about like raising venture capital and such is because they either like don't want to lose equity and they just want to self-bootstrap it. And this is why the SBIR program is great. It's a lot of like non-dilutive funding. You can get up to like 75 to 250K depending on which administration you're working with. I know like NSF and NASA award like a pretty healthy amount if you're looking to commercialize within those verticals. And that kind of allows you to get those funds and kickstart like the market research aspect, conduct surveys, maybe hire if you want to bring on someone like at an hourly rate. You probably can't like pay salary with that, but that's a very unique opportunity. And if you do understand who you're working with at the government level too, you'll also reap a lot of those benefits. A great example is like what's happening in like El Segundo, right? Where the startup founders are very close with the mayor. They're launching their own like incubators and accelerator programs for defense tech, especially.
Awesome. What have been some of the big challenges that you faced as a founder, working in a space that you're not from a background in, like government, and how have you and the team addressed that?
Yeah, so it's definitely a lot of like doubt from two ends. One is kind of like just personal imposter syndrome sometimes because it's like you're looking at a lot of like your competitors and founders in the space, and all of them are definitely like, oh, they worked in the DoD, they did this and that, right? And then also like from customers, right? Because they've sold to the government a lot, and then they see someone and they're like, oh, it's pretty technical. But we've actually used that and flipped it to our advantage. And the way we did that is by essentially trying to dog food our own product. One thing we're trying to do right now is like actively win like an SBIR potentially. And what that requires is a lot of this like tedious manual work. So that's where we're really trying to become aware of the full situation. And I would say another big challenge that I faced too was also underestimating the power of like in-person networking. A lot of these things, like especially like post-COVID, everyone's like defaulted to like virtual meetings, and that's kind of like stuck with everyone since then. But in a field like govtech, which is predicated on having a great network and stuff, I recently realized the opportunity of like going to DC is actually huge. There's a lot of older folks, especially in this industry, that aren't gonna like connect or bond with someone as naturally over like a Zoom or Google Meets as if like, I don't know, getting whiskey after some conference. So that's definitely one big thing I've realized.
I'm wondering for you, like, how do you envision Sweetspot growing in the next couple of years, and what strategies would you implement to make that happen?
So team-wise, I would say we are still trying to be like pretty lean. That's something that we learned in YC as well. It's to only hire when it hurts. A lot of people just default to hiring immediately, and that just leads to like uncomfortable conversations later on where it's like having to let people go if like your sales targets aren't hit, right? So that's definitely like one big thing. I would say that the grand evolution of our business could go like two ways. One is something we're trying to actively do like within the next few months, which is move kind of like laterally into state, local, and educational governments. Right now, we solely focus on federal government contracts, right? And that's all like well and good because like the DoD comprises like most of that. But there's like $1.5 trillion or so like sitting in like some of these SLED contracts. And that's where we're trying to go next. And it's huge because a lot of businesses looking to get into government contracting will actually just want to start smaller at certain of these like SLED levels. Moving to federal contracting immediately is like pretty daunting. And the mission of our software is to actually make government contracting like more easy and accessible to a lot of people looking to get into it. And that's where I think it's huge. Moving on, like just from the US perspective too, we've also received our fair share amount of connection, like requests to like essentially expand internationally too. Like Australia has their own set of RFPs, RFIs, RFQs. So does like the EU, so does like the UK. A lot of these like international governments need help with government procurement, and nobody knows like for certain yet, but that could be something that we're exploring.
Awesome. So how do you plan to expand your reach within the actual government itself? Like talking to startups and saying like, hey, the government can be a customer. You use Sweetspot to facilitate that.
Yeah, for sure. So expanding our reach within like the government itself, I think SBIRs are a great way to do that, because like you can chop it up with like some of these like agency directors and program managers like after a point, especially if you move up the phases. So like if you get to like phase 3 or something where you're trying to commercialize it, you can get great network connections from that. Attending a lot of these events is great because the network within GovCon is huge. Another thing like business-wise that we're trying to do too is like more affiliate marketing. And this is extremely helpful if you like look to partner with some thought leaders who already have an existing reach within GovCon. And if you can sell them on their product, that's where it essentially allows their network and their audience to benefit from it. And these network effects just rapidly multiply throughout the industry, and looking forward to seeing what happens with it.
Awesome. Yeah, so I don't want to take up all the questions. I want to open it up for everyone, especially those who are thinking about building businesses in GovTech, for an open Q&A here.
I think generally, like, just to start it off, I'm wondering, like, what trends you're seeing within the GovTech space, and where do you think government contracts falls within that?
So within the GovTech space, the vertical that we're in right now, which is procurement, is like a huge thing. And this is because people realize that it serves like almost 40% of the GDP if you can solve it. Because government's like spending essentially is like right around like 43, 44%, and it's like constantly increasing, like barring like the COVID year we had. So that's definitely like a huge trend right now. Another thing I'm seeing is a lot of people working to essentially transition the government off its existing legacy systems into like cloud-based software. So you'll see a lot of these public sector teams at like Google or like Asana or Box or Snowflake and all these orgs try to essentially like get them to like their own software. So that's another huge trend I'm seeing. It's essentially like the modernization of old legacy tech. And with that comes a lot of opportunities for procurement, which is why I'm pretty bullish on our future.
Do you think you could talk a little more about like the funding journey for Sweetspot and like what other startups can do to kind of get into that round?
Yeah, so for us, for funding, we were definitely like benefited by the YC Halo. It sends a positive signal to like a lot of investors because it's kind of like a pre-screening, if you will, and it decreases the amount of due diligence that follow-on investors have to do. So like a good advice would be to like try to find like some accelerator programs which similarly have that. But also if you don't have access to these immediate like accelerators or incubators, you can definitely go after the government themselves. And that's why anyone who's building in GovTech can greatly benefit from that. Because one, you don't lose any equity. Two, you actually get like a sizable amount of cash, where if you're starting as like a student, it's still a lot, right? You're not overly dependent on like millions of dollars, and you kind of have like enough of a buffer to know that you want to take like a year off to pursue it and you're not going to go bankrupt. So that would be one huge thing. And also this goes to like any of y'all here, but if you do need any interest, any investors, or would like a referral on your YC app, like happy to chat with.
Yeah, when it comes to that piece on investors, have you had any conversations or looked at any investors that don't care about accelerator programs, like invested very pre-seed or seed stage? An example of this might be like Higher Ground Labs, which is political tech. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so most of the traditional investors that we had were actually like organized seed funds. We haven't had too many interactions with like political specific orgs. We do have some angel investors who do like have like more background in the space, but it's not like a firm in and of itself. So I'm not the most qualified person to talk about that, but we did go after organized seed funds. And like a bit of advice that I'll give you on why that's a good reason is, right, if you raise from like some of these very large prestigious firms, right, if they do your seed round but don't reinvest at your A round, no other prestigious investor will like want to give you capital, right? Because they'll be like, oh, they've worked with them, they've seen how they did. And the thing is, after a certain level of prestige, like people start talking. And when people start talking, that's when your reputation either goes like really good or bad. And for a lot of seed stage companies, like people just want to de-risk it. So working with these seed stage firms is definitely recommended. Or angels. Angels are your best friends because you get access to their network directly and it's way less bureaucratic.
Like when you're seeking funding, how do you balance, getting funding and like overvaluing, I guess, your company too fast?
Yeah, so for us, we definitely wanted to raise like a very modest amount of funding because one, we weren't too sure whether raising a ton of money was even like necessary. Since we work in GovTech and our product is more so like B2B SaaS and software oriented, it's naturally like pretty high margins. We're not like trying to send something to space or like build some huge like hardware assembly line, right? And that's why we found the balance by also chatting with our YC group partners. They saw a lot of trends and correlations between companies which have like raised too much or like raised too little. Personally, this is just my own thing too. If you raise too much, you also sort of lose like the drive that like pushes you to like go forward. It feels like you have like some unlimited sandbox, and personally, like it doesn't motivate you nearly as much, right? When you have a very modest amount and you set realistic targets for your company to hit, I think that's really where you hit that sweet spot, if you will, of like raising a solid amount of capital and also having the drive to like get at it every day.
There's a question on the chat and then two more raised hands, but I'll read the one on the chat first. What did you find the most difficult aspect of signing customers and emphasizing the value that you provide?
Yeah, so the most difficult aspect of signing customers, like in the early days when we were starting out, was the fact that we didn't have any like street cred on the block. There's a lot of these like huge incumbents in our industry, like Deltech, like GovWin, GovTribe, and the thing is everyone will always be like, oh, what's better than theirs? And also due to the demographic that we interact with, like sometimes like a lot of the older folks aren't like convinced about AI yet. They're worried about data protection. They're worried like what we're doing with their data. In the future, we're going to be doing like some audits and stuff to help like close some of these more legacy clients. But I would say that was definitely like a huge blocker. And when we started having demos showing people like the ins and outs of our products and how it worked, it was fantastic. I would say for 99% of startups, it's best to start selling before you start building so you know exactly what you need to do. A lot of times like people get caught up just building something that they think they want. But we ourselves were in that situation where like we're not government contractors. We don't know what we want. It's not like we're building like some developer like autocomplete code generation tool or anything, right? So I feel like we did a decent amount of research and I think it's paid off.
When it comes to selling before building in the GovTech space,
Yep.
could you walk us through what that looks like?
Yeah, so as far as selling before building, the great part about government data is it's all public, right? You know exactly who's registered to like sell to the government, you know who's won grants in the past, you know who's been awarded different things, right? So it makes reach out very easy in the early days, especially if it's like more cold email oriented. And that's nice because when you initially start your reach out, you're not going to get like a bunch of these inbound leads that just come at you. So starting that cold outbound process was accelerated because of that. And I would say the inbound happened over time due to various marketing efforts. A lot of our customer base is on LinkedIn. So making consistent quality LinkedIn content is fantastic for that. Definitely like marketing promotions by YC themselves helped get a decent flow of audience, and then it's kind of like a bunch of sales tactics you can do from there. One such example is like a lot of people sometimes ask for like discounts on like products because you're just starting out. So you'd be like, I'll give you that discount if you can like intro our product to like 2 or 3 other people. And what this does is it kind of establishes that train of like spreading the word of mouth, having a close like relationship with your customers, knowing exactly like how they're using our software, and also getting like similar demographics with them. Another kind of like sales hack that I do a lot is at first when I was starting out, I had no idea what conferences to attend. And that's pretty important because like you don't want to go to a conference that's just not your customer base and then go from there. So after we started aggregating like, I want to say like 10, 15 customers, I personally like talked to each of them and I was like, hey, like what conferences do you go to? Because we enjoy working with you. We hope you see a lot of value out of our product, and we want to spread it to like more like-minded people. So someone actually just told me what conference they were going to. So I went to the SAME conference in San Antonio like back in November, and that was great to reach a lot of people of the same demographic. And I would definitely recommend it if you're looking to sell into GovTech to like zero in on something like that.
How long has Sweetspot been a thing?
So Sweetspot's been a thing since like February 28th of like it's our 1 year anniversary. That's great. That's pretty nice. But the thing is, we actually only pivoted into working on this GovTech vertical in June.
Okay.
So everything before then was our original food truck idea I was mentioning earlier.
What have been some of the most challenging things as founders, as people working in the GovTech space over the last year?
Yeah, so founder-wise, like the most glaring thing is like you don't know as much about the industry as people who have already like been in there, and this uniquely applies to us. It's an ongoing effort of just trying to learn as much as possible about it. It's also having the willpower to like show up and do your job every day. And I feel like that's something like everyone struggles with at some point, but it's extremely highlighted in a startup, right? Because if you're having like a C or D minus day, like the entire team's gonna get affected. So like showing up to work every day, like trying to put in like the best like foot forward that you can, and like keeping the morale high, keeping momentum going. That's definitely some parts that we've had like highs and lows for, but right now things are going great. And hopefully it continues forward into the future as we release our V1.
Do you have any good stories of a fire alarm scenario where like shit hits the fan, you're like, what is going on? Tell us about some.
Tons of these. There's been a lot of times, like especially like back in the SF days when we were going through the YC batch, when we just released our software and we found out like, it's just straight up down, like nothing's working, right? So put on like Herculean efforts in like the mornings to like fix those. Like credit to my two great founders, Philip and Andrew. They're some of like the best engineers I've worked with. They're responsible for a lot of like the technical firefighting and such, and obviously couldn't have made it through any of this without them.
Amazing. And then, looking a little bit ahead, are there any additional markets that, Sweetspot wants to approach or hit in the future? Where do you see the future that Sweetspot wants to create for businesses?
Yeah, so the SLED markets is great. The state, local, and educational market, where we expand to some of these governments instead of just working with the federal government, helping businesses win the SBIRs and STTRs themselves so we can help them get funding. I feel like we have a great network for that since we went through like YC. And YC itself has a lot of these startups, and not all of them are always trying to raise like venture capital, right? So sitting at some sort of like middleman or layer between that where we can help some of these companies like close their rounds sometimes, it's a great feeling. And I think another thing is, I think I was kind of alluding to it earlier, but going into international markets. So trying to service like Australia, Pacific like regions. I would say India has a huge procurement market. And the cool thing about our software too is it's pretty like language agnostic. So it could theoretically work in any country in the world.
That's awesome. I think there's a question on Zoom, then we'll go to Michael. Ishan, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, thanks so much for coming through and speaking such I had a question about a couple of things you've said so far. So, as you mentioned earlier, when you're working with government, or folks that interface with the government, particularly the DoD, they're going to have a lot of security and other compliance concerns. But at the same time, you start selling before you start building. How do you address potential client concerns about non-compliance before you have a product to show them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one standard thing is to actually pursue like an LOI, which is like a letter of intent. It's basically like some sort of like bureaucratic-esque form that you can like send to any enterprises or businesses you're looking to work with. That's a huge thing that a lot of companies in YC do too, because it's kind of like promised revenue that's not realized yet. Another great thing that you can do is grandfather them into future updates. That's something that we've been doing a lot too, where we don't meet all the compliance and like regulatory like wants of these people, right? So we can tell them like, hey, if you like sign now, we're gonna like figure that out, and any future software updates, we promise we're not gonna upsell you. And this is pretty important because it shows like you're looking out for your early customers, and your early customers are also looking to immediately shape the direct future of your product. And then also asking them what specific compliance items they need can also be generalized, because it's not like there's one compliance item that only one company needs and nobody else needs. Like NIST 800 like 171 is like a pretty like general thing for handling like COI, right? So if you can get that for that one company, it only helps your company in the longer term. So I would say that's the biggest thing over there.
Thank you so much, and great to hear all the fantastic work that the Sweetspot team is doing.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming today. My LinkedIn wall is flooded with your posts, so the LinkedIn marketing is certainly working from my point of view. I want to ask more, I don't know if you spoke on this earlier because I came in late, about how you met your co-founders, built your team. Just if you could speak more to the team dynamic, which I know all startup founders say is a crucial part of building that. Can you talk more about that team dynamic?
Yeah, certainly. So all three of us went to UT Austin. That's where we all met each other. Hook up. Philip and I have been best friends since freshman year of college. We've done a lot of things. We worked at Coinbase together, and Philip and Andrew had separately, while we were in college, done self-driving car startup together. So that didn't really work out, but they already had the existing team dynamic of knowing each other both on a business and personal level. And basically right after I got laid off from Coinbase, I was just kind of looking for things to do, and Philip was just over at my place one day, and we decided to start the old version of Sweetspot. Andrew joined after we got into YC. He was in the middle of a quant job. So Andrew was big into software engineering at some of these firms like Chicago Trading Company and Acuna. And basically, he was the best engineer we knew. We did everything we could to convince him to leave, and eventually he did, and the rest is history from there. So I think one key element of having good co-founding stories is sacrifice. Obviously, I didn't have to sacrifice anything because I was literally laid off. But Philip sacrificed a lot by quitting his job at Coinbase, which is absolutely printing right now in terms of stock. That is a ton of money right there. And then Andrew, obviously, it's not quants don't pay well at all. They play fantastic. So there's a lot of sacrifice involved. He even backed out of his mortgage to come live with us. So I feel the self-trust that we have in each other, you materially change the trajectory of your life to work with us, is kind of the thing that keeps us together. And moving forward, I think it's just always something that we can fall back on, because that initial barrier of trust has been there. It's not someone that you just randomly bumped into on the side of the road or at some hackathon, and it's let's do this together. It's something where it's we have gone to battle, done things for each other, and we'll do everything we can to keep this afloat and hopefully make it a unicorn.
Yeah, amazing. Any regrets?
Yeah, I would say one big regret that I initially had when starting was trying to zero in too much on only selling to these small businesses. So initially, a lot of our sales cycle was directly selling into these SMBs, and we always kind of put it off as we'll focus on these enterprises later. But little did we realize after the fact that these enterprises had these laundry lists of compliance items, and the sooner we got started on them, perhaps the better it would have been, right? Because then you have more time to get your SOC 2 audits, you have more time to get all your qualifications and your certs necessary to work with them. That's something we're aggressively pursuing right now. I'm sure you know because you've been on some of these calls with me, but yeah, that's basically it. I would say that's the biggest regret, and I wouldn't say anything else is more a regret, even though they've been mistakes. They've more so been learning lessons. I'm definitely not going to regret the days where we were doing the original Sweetspot before we pivoted into this. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Amazing. Any other questions? Awesome. So, go for it.
Where are you in the monetization phases, right? So have you started monetizing? Do you have paying clients? Where are you?
Yeah, so right now we have paying clients. We monetize. We're a flat $200 a month. But with our new version of our software, with our V1, which will include the proposal writer, as well as the management features that I mentioned earlier, that'll be right around $1,000 a month. And for that, that's where we can serve some of these more larger teams. So proposal writing shops who write proposals on behalf of other startups, that's a great client. Businesses that are doing more than $5 million a year, but maybe not more than $100 million a year are great. And then for enterprises, we'll have their own plans because they'll need the necessary audits and certifications of them. Yeah, that's basically it on our monetization part. And another cool thing that we're thinking about doing in the future is potentially even helping people win some of these grants, these SBIRs and stuff. And using our own software in-house, and then we could even do like a variable fee by like taking like a percentage cut of like whatever we help win them, almost as if we're doing like some sort of in-house commission.
There was a question up there that said, what did your first set of customers look like? And could you also describe like discovering customers before the pivot and then after the pivot?
Yeah. I suppose I'll start with the second question. It's more natural. So discovering customers before the pivot was a lot of emailing restaurants. I used to go on TripAdvisor and scrape like a bunch of these places, which I thought that would be good clients. And that's where we got like our first few customers from. I would say that the biggest thing though for us to integrate with people was going to the actual location. So I used to go to several of these food truck parks all around Austin. There's this place called Thicket Park. That place I went to at least like 3 or 4 times within the span of like a few days to help set our first customer up. He's definitely not going to be watching this, but Luis, I still remember you, man. Like, you're great to work with. That was definitely what it looked like. And as for our first set of customers for our current startup, it was definitely a lot of smaller startups that were from YC. So one great example was another YC startup called like Bunting Labs. They did like map digitization. There was another startup that did like solar panel work. That's called like Amatera Tech. They also work great with us. So a lot of these initial customers were like 2 to 3 people total within the actual company. But now we're starting to work with teams that have like maybe like 10 or 15 or so, and we're looking to rapidly scale that. Yep.
I'm wondering for you, like, I feel like I hear a lot of stories of founders pivoting, and it's a pretty common thing to do. But for me, like when I did a major, like when I pivoted my major, it was like an existential crisis.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering for you, like, what was the thought process that went into this sort of pivot, and like what were the pros and cons of it at the time?
Yeah. So for us, the pivot was like pretty natural. And it happened because we had like these conversations with like some of our investors. And what that did is it kind of allowed us to like see their point of view. And we obviously like trusted them to a good extent. They see like thousands of these startups throughout their years of YC, right? So that definitely did like some damage control. And more than that, it was also realizing that our current software offering, which is like B2B SaaS, is definitely more like venture scalable. When it comes to like food trucks, right? You almost need to like have your own point of sale system at scale because a lot of them use like these different like OSs. And that involves like sending people tablets like DoorDash did in the early days, right? And getting hardware involved, like it's just a bunch of things that it's not stuff that we traditionally like were good at. But when it came to like talking to clients, understanding their pain points as well as understanding a little bit more about the industry because we had a friend who was already involved, it was great. Like none of us knew like the first thing about hospitality either. And since the margins are much lower in restaurants, it's hard to really break through. With GovTech, while it may be hard to break through at like times, like I mentioned earlier, it's super network predicated, and that's something we took a bet on. Like we have a great network through YC, know a ton of people. Let's like roll up our sleeves and get started.
Awesome. Yeah, I kind of want to send it back to you to give us some closing thoughts on your journey and some advice for people looking to build in the early stage GovTech space. I want to also then, after you're done, pass it to Dave and Paula to give an introduction about what Governance Lab is going to look like in the fall.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, just some closing thoughts from my end. I would say like the journey of being like a founder is something that's very like depressing at times, but it's also simultaneously very rewarding. You're either responsible for like the success of your company or like the failure of it. And there's times where it feels like it go either way, and like pushing through is definitely like the most important thing. It definitely helps to have co-founders, and that's why I'm glad I have Philip and Andrew. Being a solo founder must be like one of the hardest things in the world. I've never experienced it, so I can't attest to how hard it is, but I've spoken to many people who are, and it's just a mess, right? It's super hard, and it takes a certain kind of person to do it. When it comes to actually like building in a space, right? This is a GovTech lab, and I assume like anyone over here who's like interested in doing a startup may be more like, civic tech or like GovTech related. I would definitely say like try your very hardest to not get like, demotivated by the fact that you may not know as much as some of the other founders out there. Like at the end of the day, like all of us for the most part, are going to be doing like startups like in our mid-20s or like early 30s. And some of these GovTech founders are like in their 40s or 50s, right? And you think like, oh, this wise old sage knows so much about the industry, right? But I think a cool part about it is like the naivety of not knowing too much about it allows you to have a new angle and perspective on the industry. You really know what to push forward. And I think that's what Sweetspot's brand itself is. It's being a very tech-forward company rather than being super like, bureaucratic, focus on preserving the status quo and accelerating that. It's kind of thinking of new angles to approach the space. And I would say that's something that we've done pretty well so far.
I think that question's already been answered. But thank you so much for speaking at our first session of the Governance Lab. I want to let's do a quick round of applause for yourself. I want to pass it to Dave and then Paolo to talk a little bit more about GovLab.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. We're starting a governance lab at the Institute of Politics. It's going to be the first major space for Harvard College students to be able to develop a startup idea that's focused on social impact related to governance and creating an impact in the political sphere. I kind of want to touch on some of the things that you mentioned. There often is a lack of support, and I think that's kind of what we're trying to solve with Governance Lab. Just for students who are in college in their undergrad years, they don't have a lot of experience, they don't have a lot of mentorship. That's what we're trying to address directly with people like Paolo and other potential mentors who will be like an entrepreneur in residence. Through a 10-week workshop, we're going to have up to 10 venture teams here at the college, kind of hash out their ideas, develop a startup, and then eventually culminate in a pitch competition. So that's our initiative. You want to add anything?
First, thank you for joining us to kick us off, and thanks everybody for coming. And we're all super excited with the prospects for the fall. I feel that there is a little bit of a gap that this initiative will fill, which is kind of this intersection of government, technology, and entrepreneurship, right between here the Kennedy School and all the other schools, including the law school and the college. So I'm really looking forward to working with you all and spread the news, right? Tell your friends, and hopefully we'll have several of you join us in the next few weeks and into the fall.
Awesome. I know we haven't scheduled it yet, but our next conversation will be with Civic Roundtable. Saba, do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so our next conversation will be, we did schedule it. But it was let me find the date. It's March 22nd from 4 to 5 p.m. in the same room. We might change up the room, but it's going to be 4 to 5 p.m. And Mads is the founder of Civic Roundtable, which is a GC-backed platform that allows government officials and team members to be able to communicate with one another when implementing new practices within their government. So, for example, a government in Oregon can connect with a government in California about a new procurement process, for example, or any sort of new process that's being implemented within their government. So